Baroliya and my fellow presenters Vishwa, Parmar, Trupti, Naik and Yashraj Sodha. We are going to discuss the article of E.V. Ramakrishnan, Shifting Centers and Emerging Margins, Translations and the Shaping of Modernist Poetic Discourse in Indian Poetry. So, first of all, the objectives, which are interpreting cross-cultural influence, shifting literary centers, modernist expressions, interdisciplinary connections, and decolonizing literature. Research problems can be how has translation influenced the development of modernist poetic discourse in Indian poetry, and what are the challenges of balancing global modernist influence with local cultural and linguistic traditions in Indian poetry. Another one, what are the difficulties in accurately representing the nuance of Indian poetry across different languages through translation, and how do translations addresses or perpetuate colonial ideologies in Indian poetry. Talking about the methodology, which examines translations of Indian poetry alongside their originals to identify shifts in meaning, tone, and cultural context, incorporates perspectives from translation studies, cultural theory, and postcolonial studies to frame the study. Investigates both the textual transformations that occur during translation and their implications within broader cultural and historical context. Concentrates on themes like cultural negotiation, identity formation, and the decentralization of literary authorities as they appear in translated works. Then key findings, which the process of translation has contributed to a shift in literary focus, enabling diverse voices from regional languages to participate in a broader discourse. Translation has facilitated meaningful cultural exchanges, allowing Indian poetry to engage with global literary movements while maintaining its unique identity. The process of translating poetry involves significant challenges in preserving cultural nuance, linguistic complexities, and the original emotional depth. Translation has transformed the thematic and stylistic contour of Indian poetry, fostering innovations and experimentations in its modernist phase. Okay, moving to the introduction of the article, that is, the chapters explore with the significant influence of poetry and the time era which is dealing is 1950 and 1970, emphasizing the interplay between the global modernist idea and local Indian literary traditions. So, translation as a catalyst of modernism. Indian modernist poetry was deeply shaped by translations of Western poets like Baudelaire, Naik, Eliot, and Yeats. This translation introduced foreignizing elements, disrupting established norms of poetry rooted in romanticism and nationalist aesthetics. Role of major Indian poets as translators, like poets such as Bodhdev Bose, Agyai Dilip Chitra, and Ayyappa Panikar were also translators, and their translation acted as tools for breaking the monopoly of traditional literary sensibilities, thus creating space for alternative styles and discourses. So, little magazines and their importance, like how these little magazines were like important during that time, and how. Okay, so translations during the early modernist phase often appeared in little magazines, experimental publications that served as platform for avant-garde writings. This magazine opened up Indian poetry to global influences and helped legitimize experimental non-mainstream poetic styles. Now, a translation beyond textual practices, like drawing on Henry Lefferts's concept of translation as refraction or rewriting. The chapter expands the idea of translation to include critical essays, histories, and anthologies, commentaries. Let's take an example of Sudhirnath Datta's essay on T.S. Eliot in Bengali, like and Ayyappa Panikar's critique of Vallathol in Malayalam are considered translational writings. And this writing introduced Western modes of thinking to interrogate enriched poetic traditions. Okay, so moving to the very first part of this article, that is relation between modernity and modernism in Indian context. Like modernity in Indian context refers to the echoes of transformation changes triggered by the colonialism, which brought the changes, which includes colonialism and capitalism, industrialism, Western education, nationalism and reform, and institutional reform. Like acceleration of change, according to Dilip Chitre, the process of modernity that unfold over centuries, like Europe of like it took centuries, and India took only 50 years to cover the whole like centuries of to cover the history of Europe. This rapid transformation led to a crisis of identity and tradition, forcing Indian writers to engage with foreign traditions creatively. The cross-pollination of cultures, where B.S. Madhekar, as a major Marathi modernist, epitomized this synthesis, that his poetry reflected a fusion of India's deeper, larger native tradition with contemporary world culture, illustrating the interactions between local and global modernist traditions. Oppositional content of Indian modernism. Like despite this aesthetic roots in colonial ideology, Indian modernism was oppositional in nature, nature. D.R. Nagaraj highlighted how writers disillusioned by the co-options of nationalism and spirituality into state apparatus retreated into individual as a means of the resistance. Writers navigate tension between traditional cultural values and modern, often align literary forms, crafting works that addressed local concerns while engaging with global discourses. Okay, so the second part is the historical way of looking at West and India. Indian modernism in a global context. Indian modernism has not been recognized as part of the global modernist movement, largely because the discourse is titled in the favor of Western modernism. Like India is not looked upon as a global as compared to the Western one. So Indian modernism arising in a post-colonial context carried unique political complexities. It wasn't merely derivative of European modernism, but was shaped by the specific socio-political and historical dynamics of the subcontinent. Contextualizing Indian modernism, Western modernism is often seen as detached and universalist, but Indian modernism is rooted in a specific socio-political dynamics. Indian modernism engages deeply with the local and historical, addressing contradictions between the past and present. Critics like Rebecca Volkowitz and other advocate for studying modernism in their plural forms, recognizing them as diverse and context specific rather than a monolithic European phenomenon. Reimagining modernism beyond Eurocentrism. Critics like Simon Gikande, Susan Friedman, Laura Doyle, and others argue that non-Western modernism are not simply imitative of Western modernism, and modernism is non-European. In non-European societies such as Asian, Africa, and Latin America should be understood within their own context rather than being relegated to the periphery status relative to a European centers. So yes, looking at my learning outcomes, the impact of translating European poets like Eliot Yeats and development of on the Indian modernist poetry. Okay, so personally, what I feel is as a child, we used to feel like sitting over there only. I felt the translation means whatever we are studying right now. If someone is saying something in English, and what is our mother tongue? That is Gujarati. So what we'll do, someone is saying to understand, we'll just think it in our own language and then we'll know that what is trying to say. So that was for me. But when I get to know that how translation works, that how, like, going into the in-depth, I get to know that, oh, bhai, this is not what I'm thinking. It's totally different. So yes, this was from my side. Thank you. Now I would like to invite Vishwa Parmar.
Hello everyone. I discuss part 3 and 4. Part 3, the receptions of Western modernist discourse in India. Indian modernism was mediated by local socio-political dynamics. Each regional tradition evolved based on its unique historical and cultural context. Bengali modernism involved rejecting Tagore's influence. Modernism reflected caste-based tensions and reacted to Nehruvian ideals. Issues like caste, region, and individualism varied in importance across different traditions. The roles of father figures like Tagore was region-specific and not universal applicable. The major points like local dynamic in modernism. The receptions of Western modernist discourse in India was shaped by local socio-political unreal, including the formations of the nation state and shifting power structure. Each literary traditions evolved differently based on its unique historical and cultural givens. Varied manifestation. Modernism in India cannot be generalized due to the differing sensibility and configurations on regional language and traditional. Each region and language had its own mode of engaging with a modernist idea. Bengali modernism. In Bengal, modernism involved a deliberate break from Rabindranath Tagore, right, turned away from his influence to meet the demand to their historical movement, using modernism as a tool of rejections and renewal. Kannada modernism was deeply influenced by conflict between Brahminical and non-Brahminical ideologies. It emerged as reactions to the Nehruvian political and cultural environment, reflecting the social tensions, caste, region, and individualism. Modernist traditions in Indian addressed themes like caste, authenticity, freedom, progress, and individualism differently based on regional and cultural context. Role of key figure. The influence of key figures like Tagore was central to Bengali modernism but not relevant to the development of modernism in Kannada or Malayalam, showcasing the diversity of modernist traditions across India. Part 4, translating modernism, the role of translations in shaping Indian literary traditions. To examine the pivotal roles of translations in shaping modernism within Indian literature by focusing on three prominent modernist authors from distinct linguistic traditions, Sudhindranath Dutt, B.S. Martekar, and Ayappa Panikars. It traces the chronological process. Progress of modernist across their literary culture emphasize how traditional serves into introduce and validate modernist atheistic. As a bilingual authors, they compose critical essays in both English and their native language, actively challenging the prevailing romantic nationalist and romantic mystical regime through their translation and critical works. They bridge Indian and Western literary traditions, fostering a transformative redefinitions and of poetic form and content. Chronological evolutions of modernism in Indian literature. Bengali modernism emerged in the 1930 to continued into the 15th. Marathi modernism became prominent in the 1950 and 16. Malayalam modernism rose in the 1960 and wanted by the late 70, but not before redefining literary aesthetics. Role of translations in modernist poetics. Translation serves as a medium of introduced modernist idea into Indian literary traditions. Sutindranath Dutt translated French poets Stephen Mallarme and Paul Valéry into Bengali. Ayappa Pinkar translated European poets into Malayalam. B.S. Mardhekar's Arts and the Man emphasized the formalist aesthetics, legitimizing modernist practices. Bilingualism and critical essays. All three authors were bilingual, writing in English and their native language to outline and validate a new poetic mode. Their essays elaborated on modernist aesthetics, contrasting them with the dominant romantic traditions, engagement with Western tradition. These authors were deeply influenced by Western philosophy, art, and literature. Their translations and writing demonstrate a critical understanding of Western modernism, significance, and limitations. Impact of modernism on Indian cultures. Modernism redefined the relationship between content and from in Indian poetry. Discursive prose by these authors serves to translate modernism into the Indian terms, making it accessible and relevant to their audience. Notable translations and contributions. Sudhindranath Dutt and Buddhadev Bose contributed significantly to the translations of Europe modernist poetry into Bengali. Ayappa Pinekar and B.S. Mardekar expanded the reach of modernist aesthetics through translations and original verse. This is my learning outcome. I understand of the localized receptions and adaptations of Western modernist discourse in Indian poetry, Indian literary traditions, the socio-political and cultural dynamics that shapes Indian modernism, including caste, ethnicity, and regional influences. Explore how traditions and bilingualism facilitated and reinterpretations of modernist aesthetics within the diverse Indian language, while also gaining insights into the involving relationship between content and from in Indian poetry. For further, I would like to call Trupti.
Sudhindranath Datta's views on poetry, tradition, and modernism. Sudhindranath Datta's a critical essay, A Necessity of Poetry, in which he argues that the primacy of the world, in which he discussed with Aristotle, Plato, Byron, and Hughes that, and he proved his mastery through the Western thought. Datta argues poetry is essential across societies, even among the unsophisticated, showing its necessity. Believes only poetry can provide associations where reasons fail, rejecting the centrality of reason in modern society, in which Sudhindranatha Datta says that sometimes logic and emotions through the poetry are understand easy, but when the logic and ideas are easy to understand. A role of the creative artist, in which Datta agrees with Virginia Woolf's idea that artist needs moments to retreat but emphasizes staying connected to society's need, underlines the importance of the mess- message in shaping literary tradition, stating that intellectuals must meet the pragmatic taste of the people. Criticism of Anglicists, in which Datta criticized the writers who follow blindly British traditions, and he called them Anglicists. Critics Anglicists for failing to free the people from colonial illusions. Praises Gemini Roy's use of traditional Indian art to create a universal mode of presentation. Datta's modernist poetics and the crisis of tradition, modernism and decolonization. Modernism in India was not a celebration of Western values but a part of decolonizing project. Datta endorses Eliot's commitment to tradition, which he says as revolutionary and necessity of survival. This we can see in the T.S. Eliot's work, Traditional and Individual Talent. The Camel Bird, a poem of crisis and survival. The camel bird in the poem, camel bird as a metaphor, which shows poets' alienation and disconnection from the past, symbolizes by the vulnerable bird, emphasize the need for reinvention and survival in a world of ruins where the poet searches of meaning amidst violence. quest for humanity and community. The poem goes beyond the personal crisis, embodying the inertia of colonized community and the search of humanity in the fragmented world. In this, we can see that the poet is trying to say that the traditional is important, but at the same time, we cannot solve the modern everyday life problem through the tradition. B.S. Madhekar and the transformation of Marathi poetry. Modernist aesthetic in Marathi poetry. Before Madhekar, the Marathi poetry was tradition and simple. But Madhekar adds a new idea and a new way of writing. Madhekar, alongside P.S. Rage, introduced modernism in Marathi poetry, drawing influences from Western modernists like T.S. Eliot. Both poets reinvented Marathi poetic traditions, revisiting saint poets like Tukaram and Ramdas for a modern audience. Response to cultural fragmentation. Madhekar's work responds to the moral and cultural disintegration his experience, particularly in urban Bombay. His poetry reflects an intricate relationship with tradition and modernity, influenced by figures like Jyotiba Phule and Bhimrao Ambedkar. Madhekar in that supports that he mixes the Marathi in Marathi poetry, a traditional words and also a modern everyday life language words. Complex poetic practice. His poetry blends irony and self-reflection, exploring societal contradictions and personal alienations. Key poems and modernist technique. Mice in the wet barrel died. Madhekar uses grim imagery such as sadness as a poisonous ice and made of glass to depict the harshness of modern life. The poem reflects urban despair and existential suffering through vivid metaphors. Subversive language and irony. The poet combines modern and archaic language like jeeb and jiva to create a unique poetic voice. In that, we can see that the traditional words and also everyday modern life language. This blend of language creates a strike contrast, enhancing the subversive nature of his work. Although the lights, Madhekar explore urban alienation, blending human and mechanical elements to depict a dehumanized cityscape. The poem highlights despair through vivid contrasting imagery. In the poem, we can see the word like rubber city, which shows a loneliness and sadness in a city life. Learning outcome, role of translation. I understand how translation help connect different culture and languages in Indian poetry. Modernist poetry learned how Indian poets use new ideas and style to make a poetry modern and unique. Cultural influence explore how history and culture shape modern Indian poetry. Regional voices appreciate the importance of regional and local languages in Indian poetry. Global trends see how Indian poets adapt global ideas to fit their own traditions. Now, I would like to call Yashraj to continue this presentation.
Hello everyone. As like previously discussed, the article was in the 8 part, so I am discussing the part 7 and part 8. Part 8 is for the concluding part. In the first, the 7th part, it is like the this Ayappa Panikar and his poem Kurukshetra. So how he used the modernist imagery in his poem. So in the article we discuss this. Ayappa Panikar was a romantic poet turned into the modernist, active in shaping the Malayalam literary modernism. His key contribution is to translating the global poetry into Malayalam, advocate for rejecting the traditional prosody in the favor of rhythmic free verse, critical intervention against the colonial figures like Velathul Narayan Menon. The Kurukshetram, the poem, it was published in 1960. Structure 294 lines in the 5 sections with the epigraph of the Bhagavad Gita. Now, in which way we find that the epigraph is written taken from the this Bhagavad Gita. The same thing we find in the T.S. Eliot's poem, The West End also. He is bringing the epitaph from the Greek mythology and Latin mythology. So that we also find. In the theme, we find the reflect moral decline and the societal disintegration again to T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. The same thing we find. Imagery and the themes of Kurukshetram. The opening imagery we find that there is an explosion of decline and chaos. I suck in sip in the tears that spurt, that suggest the organic societal collapse. So, like in the T.S. Eliot's this Westland, we also find there is a total integration and the whole of the society. The central symbol we find the Kurukshetram as the metaphor for conflict and struggle. Now let's analyze the poem. Public critic of the societal decline. Like the society is, all the people are suffering that retreat to private introspection disrupt the harmony and internal internal visions. Innovation in the mythical figures, highlighting the modern alienation, rejection of the faith and politics, search for self-reliance. Gandhi is a failed prophet, redemption sought through the imagination and dreams. So there we find like it was like before all the philosophies are given. In the Indian philosophy, we also find there are all the answers are given, but right now the individually one has to suffer. So that type of imagery we find that. Philosophical insight we find modernist poetic vision reject the allegorical and didactic traditions, integrates the personal and public realms of the existence. Kurukshetram relevance today resonate with the global modernist discourse that offers the critique of contemporary society and the poet's existential struggle. In the ending note, we find the imagination as the sole redeemer in the fragmented world. Panika's legacy, a transformative figure in the Malayalam poetry, bridging the tradition and modernism. So includes the both traditionality and modernism together. A symbolic imagery we find the navel-born lotus of Brahma, a metaphor for rebirth and creativity. Now in the ending note, we don't find any personal answer is given, but we find that all the like the existential crisis. And there we find that the visual imagery that we have in the Indian mythology that Brahma came from the Vishnu's navel. He sprouted from that. So there we find that. In the part 8 conclusion, we find the post-colonial context and indigenous modernity. How he discussed the whole article in the concluding part. Writers had to access the internal critics of the Western modernity, develop alternative tradition and modernity in the native context, selective assimilation of the Western modernity on their own terms, translation of modernism through the post-colonial perspective. Now they are bringing the modernity from the Western world, but they also have to find out that they find the Indian context into it. So there we find dual nature of relationship, internal dialectic. We find that writers related to their culture and critical outsider, critical provision of the nature of their culture, valued cosmopolitan worldviews. And the external dialogic we find that negotiated with Western modes of without surrendering to ideology, maintain the critical distance from the grand narratives, develop the complex relationship with the fragmented society. Now, what role does the translator play in this context? Enables the writers to be both within and without. Their speech community answer the deep needs for their ambivient existence. Bilingual sensibility demanded expression that could move between native and alien traditions. The modernist subject in Indian context, the fragment is different from the Western context. Colonial modernity operates as a realm of desire, created a new social imagery, and formalist poetic correspondent to the inner world of a desire. Language and self-expression. Language become only reality writers could relate to, enable moment of recognition through the Western modernist discourses, self-reflective moments was post-colonial in essence, questioned the prevailing limits of freedom, created the interior mode of being. What are my learning outcome from that? I get to know of the role of the translator in shaping the modernist poetic discourse in Indian literatures. How like modernism is brought into the Indian context. Differences between the Indian and European modernism due to post-colonial context. Modernist poets' negotiation between the tradition and the modernity, indigenous and Western. Diversity of post-colonial political ideologies and experimental styles within the Indian modernist tradition. Like previously, I used to believe that the Indians are the modernism was brought into the Indian concept. It is like just a mimicry. As in the article, it is also mentioned that it is just like a mimicry. The people used to believe that, but in the article we get to know that it was influenced by the modernist Western modernism, but it has its own influence, Indian influence. Importance of studying non-Western modernism to critique Eurocentrism. these are our references, and thank you. Now I'm open for the questions.
And my question is, what key differences do we find in Indian modernism that were not present in Western modernism?
Yes. In Western modernism, we find that it was like what are the philosophies were coming from the ancient systems. So they are refusing all the philosophies, and with the World War First and Second, we find there is a total broken of the philosophies that were prevailed in the Western philosophy. The modernism emerging from that. In Indian context, we don't find that, but in the Malayalam culture, in the Marathi culture, or any other culture, we find the regional influences in the modernism. So they are the Indian writers bringing modernism in their own way. They are giving that Indian essence to that modernism. So that we can find that the key difference between the two.
So Yash, my question to you is like, can you throw more light on Ayappa's Malayalam poem which you discussed in this?
So in the Ayappa's poem, we find that there is a reference of Kurukshetra. The whole imagery is the Kurukshetra. The title also suggested that. Through that, bringing the idea of modernism from the Westland, he also discusses that the Kurukshetra, like there was a chaos, there was a war going on. So same thing in the Indian context, in the mind of the people, in the society, there is also constant war is going on. So through the poem of this Kurukshetram, he is being existential crisis idea, and he also bringing back the mythological characters like Lord Ram, Arjun. Through that imagery, he tries to show that how the mythical figures like Ram, and they are also not able to provide the solution into the modern problem. So that type of imagery we find in the poem by the Kurukshetra. Thank you. That is from my side.